So you'll notice that I already have an existing XenApp Zen desktop site built in Azure sitting on its own VNet. And what I want to do now is I want to put a pair of VPXs in front of that for remote access. So what I'm going to show you is how to build that HA pair. So you do a search for Netscaler 12 HA, and the first thing you have to do is pick a resource group. You'll notice that the template will not allow you to use a resource group that has stuff in it. So you have to either use an existing one that's empty or create a new resource group here. Select your location. Here's where you'll do your username and the password. And you can either check, select a SKU, or you can do your bring your own license and then choose what compute model. I just selected the default. The template's going to create its own VNet for this entire deployment. And it's also going to create 3 subnets. And the subnets are for management, HA communication, and then back-end server communication. And I just basically leave the defaults. Once it validates, we'll click OK and provision the HA pair. Okay, you'll notice that the deployment has been successfully completed. So now what we'll do is we'll go into that newly created resource group, and you'll see all of the components that were created with the Azure Load Balancer at the top that front ends the 2 HA VPXs. There are the network interfaces. Again, this creates 2 VPXs with 3 NICs, each on its own subnet in an HA pair. So the first thing we need to do to be able to manage the Netscalers is edit the security group that the Netscaler IP is on to allow port 443. So I went to the network security group of the first NIC, so NSG0-01 on each of the VPXs, and I added an inbound security rule to allow port 443. Well, now you'll notice that I'm on VPX 0, and you'll notice that Azure shows you the 3 NICs in a tabbed format at the top. So NIC, this is the third NIC. This is the NIC that's going to be communicating to your XenApp and Zen desktop environment. So we're also going to open up port 443 on that. You'll notice there's different ways to do the same thing in Azure. You can do it right from here if you want to, as opposed to the way that we just did it. But that's doing the same thing. I'm opening port 443 on that interface as well. And you'll see when we get further down, the reason we're doing that is because that is where we're going to attach or create our Netscaler gateway that's going to front end our existing XenApps and desktop environment over on the other, in the other resource group on that other VNet. Okay, so the security rules have been created. So the next thing we need to do, I mentioned that the template creates a new VNet with the different subnets, And I've already got an existing XenApp environment built, running. So I need to create what's called a VNet peering. This is simply a VPN between the two, if you will, but it's a very straightforward process. So you go ahead on each side and you create a peering and point to the other VNet. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a peering from the VNet that the HA pair template created to the VNet that all of my XenApp environment is sitting in. Okay. Now I'm going to go over to the existing VNet and create a peering back to the networking VNet. So I hope that makes sense. So we're basically just making it so that my VPXs can talk to my domain controller and storefront and vice versa. And you'll notice that once it creates the peering, it will have a status of connected. Now it created it. Azure doesn't automatically update that page, so you just click off, click back on, and you'll see your peering. So now we've got communication set up. And the next thing now is to go ahead and start working with our Netscaler. So you'll notice there's the public IP of VPX0. We opened port 443. So we go navigate HTTPS, and you'll see we get right to the management interface. So we can go ahead and do the same for VPX1. And we're right in the interface. So I'm going to log in. This is the username and password we set up in the template. That's VPX0. You'll notice HA is all set up and configured and running. So leveraging the template, you don't have to build the HA pieces. And here you get the little pop-up warning saying this is the secondary node. Make sure you do all your configuration changes on the primary node of the HA pair, just as we normally would. So the next step is to license our appliances. Since I did a bring your own license, I'll have to go and generate a license using the Mac that you see over there on the right. And I've gone ahead and sped that up. So I've applied my license file, and now I'll have to go ahead and reboot. You'll notice I'm on the secondary node right now. Okay, so you'll notice that the VPX is now back up and I'm at the login screen. So now I'm going to go ahead and reboot the primary node. And what this is going to do is actually switch the primary node over to what was the secondary node, because the HA pair is actually functioning as it should. I'll give this a few seconds to reboot and apply the license. Keep in mind, if you had selected one of the SKUs from Azure, you would not have to do this step. It would already be licensed when it comes up initially. Okay, so we're at the login screen. So I've gone back to VPX1, which was the secondary node. And you'll notice now it's popped up with its licensing information, and it is now the primary node, which is a good thing because that shows now that with the secondary up and it notices that the primary went down, it assumes the primary role. And there's our licensing, and there's now our note that this is secondary. And you'll notice that the HA is up and healthy. And here what I want to point out is the way that we're leveraging the IP addresses. So you'll notice that there's no public IP, and that is because Azure does a translation automatically from the public IP to the private IP. And what I'm showing you here is, so there's the private IP of each, and those are going to map directly to what you're looking at in the VPX. Okay, so those are the two subnets, and then the Netscaler IP. Let's go ahead and enable the Netscaler gateway feature as well as the SSL feature that we'll need for our gateway. And we go ahead and do that on both. And it caught up because of the HA pair. So what I'm going to do here, because we're going to front end an existing XenApp and XenDesktop environment, I'm going to go ahead and install my certificate. Now you could do this a number of ways. I'm not going to get into how you would create a certificate. I've actually obtained a wildcard cert that I've got right here. So I'm going to upload that to the appliance. And I'm going to leverage my wildcard cert. You can create your own CA, do self-signed certs. It's just standard SSL processes. So I've uploaded my wildcard cert that I'm going to leverage from my gateway. You'll notice that on the secondary node, it's already there because we're sharing that config and the HA pair. Now, we do have to fix a few things as it pertains to DNS. And that is because this VPX is leveraging the built-in DNS server from Azure, which doesn't know how to find my lab. This may differ in a production rollout, but all I'm doing here is making it so that when I do the wizard and I type in these host names, the VPX knows what IP address to look at. So this could be done a couple different ways. In my scenario here, I need this Azure load balancer here that they did for DNS. This does not understand my lab.cassis.net domain. So instead of spending a lot of time adding delegated zones, I just added 2 records for the 2 host names that I'd be using, which is Storefront and my controllers. So what we need to do now is add an IP address that we're going to use for our gateway. And that's because the IP addresses that the template creates are used for subnet IPs. So I want my own IP address, my own virtual IP, my own VIP for my Netscaler gateways. So I'm going to go ahead and add an IP address to the 3rd NIC of each VPX. Okay, we do not need a private IP address. We do not need a public IP address. And that is because there's an Azure load balancer in front of these with the IP front end that we would be accessing. And you'll see that here in a little bit. So what I've done is I've simply added another private IP address to the 3rd NIC of each VPX. So we see that I'm just showing you that 225 is indeed the subnet IP. So what we want to do is go ahead and add another IP address as we did on the previous VPX. Let's go verify. And you'll notice 10.2.2.6 has been added to VPX1. So now we're ready to go ahead and build our gateway, and we're going to do that using the XenApp and XenDesktop wizard. So we're going to click Start, Storefront. Here's our gateway. This is what remote users would type into a browser or plug into receiver to access their resources. Notice the gateway IP. It's the IP we just added, 10.2.2.6. Okay, port 443 will redirect port 80. It found my certificate, and here is where we'll plug in our storefront. Notice this is why we did the DNS record, just so it understands where to go. And we're going to go ahead and query storefront. Now my storefront has multiple stores. Yours may not. The reason is that I'm actually leveraging multiple gateway FQDNs. You want to make sure you match your store with your FQDN. So here's my storefront, just so you can understand what I'm talking about. We're going to go up, and when you configure remote settings, you can configure multiple Netscaler gateways on storefront. And each Netscaler gateway that I've configured is actually pointing to different FQDNs for various reasons. So you'll notice virtual2.cassis.net is the store 4, which is why I selected that. In most cases, you will have a single store. In here, my secure ticket authority is my controller. I only have one. You should have 2 in a production. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to our authentication. And 10.0.0.4 is my domain controller. You can obtain this information if you want to from the advanced attribute editor in Active Directory, or you can just type it in. But what you need here is essentially an account that has the ability to search the domain for authentication purposes. Typically, you'll create a service account for this. And we can test to make sure that we can bind, and we can, so we're good. We want to use the SAM account name, and we'll click continue. And that's the last piece. So we've actually configured one side of this gateway configuration, HA pair in Azure. Now, the interesting thing in Azure is that IP cannot move. So that 2.2.6 is only bound to this VPX1. So unlike a traditional on-prem deployment, we need to do a couple different things here in Azure. So I'm going to create a second gateway. So what I need to do is go to VPX0. Remember, we added that IP address. So 10.2.2.7 is now bound to VPX0. So we're going to create a second Netscaler gateway with the identical FQDN. Now, one thing I want to point out, the wizard will yell at you if you try to create the exact same FQDN. And I'll show you what will happen here when we try to do this. See the error? Not permitted because it already exists. So I simply create the same FQDN in all caps. If you were manually creating these gateways, this more than likely would not be a problem. This is just the way that I've configured this setup. We use my certificate. This is going to be exactly the same information that we put on the other gateway. So we're going to plug in our storefront FQDN. We're going to search, select store 4, plug in our controller. And we can leverage our already created LDAP server. And we're done. And now we've created 2 Netscaler gateways. One that's on each VPX. So you need to understand. So in a failover scenario, because those IP addresses cannot float in Azure, it's going to leverage the IP that's associated with each VPX. Okay. So the next step of this is to go to the Azure load balancer. This is going to be doing the load balancing piece in the case of a failure of a VPX. So the first thing we need to do is create a backend pool. So we click Add. You can name this whatever you'd like. And we're simply going to select each VPX and its associated gateway VIP that we just created. So VPX 0 will get 7, VPX 1 will get .6. And you'll want to wait and make sure that this builds out correctly. You'll see the pool pop up, and then you may see 1 virtual machine, and then you'll finally see 2 virtual machines. That's when you know that it's been built out correctly. So what I'm showing here is that we created a backend pool pointing to both of those IP addresses from the Azure load balancer. You'll notice that it's now got 1 virtual machine added to the pool. And now it's got 2. So we'll go over here and open this up. And you'll notice that it now has both VPX 0, VPX 1 pointing to the associated virtual IPs with the gateways on them. So the next step is to create a health probe. A health probe is simply going to probe port 443, which is what our gateways are running on. So once it finishes updating, you'll see the newly created probe that's going to sit there on port 443. And there it is. So the next piece of this is to create a load balancing rule. And we're going to leverage our backend pool and our probe that we just created in this rule that is going to tell the Azure load balancer about our two gateways. So we're going to leverage the existing front-end IP. That's the public IP address. This is going to be running on port 4043. The back end is port 443. We select our pool and our probe, and we click OK. So what that's going to do is that public IP is going to get hit with the FQDN of our gateway, and it's going to send it to our HA pair. So we need to take a note of this public IP address. Okay, that public IP address is what you need to have in your DNS associated with that FQDN we use for our gateway. So remember virtual2.cassis.net? I need that public IP of the Azure Load Balancer to resolve to that FQDN. And I just updated my DNS on the internet to resolve to that. So now we can just do a quick ping of virtual2.cassis.net. You'll notice it is now resolving to that IP that's attached to the Azure Load Balancer as the front-end IP. So now we can point our browser, leveraging that FQDN, to our gateway. So I'm going to type in virtual2.cassis.net, and there you have it. So we've now gone through the Azure Load Balancer, and we've hit our Netscaler gateway on the primary node. What I'm going to do here is change the theme to the X1 look. So I just went to the gateway and I went to Portal Themes. Add that, change it to X1, click OK. I did it on both gateways. And now if we refresh, you'll notice we now have the new look and feel. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. And there we have it. So we've now passed into our storefront. So we've now front-ended our existing XenApp environment that sits in that other VNet. I'm going to go ahead and launch a desktop. Okay, so there's my desktop. And what we're going to do here is we're setting up for a failure demo to show you the benefit and how the HA pair will will function in Azure. So I'm on VPX1, it's the primary, and you notice there's my ICA connection. Okay, that's the primary node. I'm going to go ahead and reboot the primary node. Of course, after I save the config. Okay, so here's my desktop. I have a current session running. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and reboot. The primary node is now rebooting, and we're going to go ahead and move the cursor up and down in the start menu so you can see the responsiveness and when it, okay, so there you go. So now is the window of time where Azure needs the backend processes of the HA pair need to kick in, and it's anywhere from about 13 to 16 seconds in Azure, and you'll notice there was that little blip, and now my session is back exactly where I was. I didn't have to disconnect. You'll notice that if I move over to VPX0 now and do a refresh, it's now the primary node. My ICA connection has moved over. And we can go take a look at the HA pair. You'll notice there's VPX1, which is still down, still rebooting. You know, and once this comes back up, obviously it will connect back up and be the secondary node. All the while that ICA session has not been hindered, other than that 13 to 16 second blip. So I'm going to go ahead and disconnect my session. And we'll wait for the HA pair to come back up and be normal. There it is. So VPX1 has now been rebooted. And there it is, back up as a secondary. And that is it. That is front-ending an existing XenApp and XenDesktop environment, leveraging the Netscaler 12 HA template. One other thing to note is the use of IPs in this configuration. So you'll notice that the HA pairs, the subnets will differ on each VPX, but the VIPs will be the same on both. So you'll notice if I log in here to VPX1, right, there's the, if I toggle back and forth, you'll notice that just the subnet IPs and the Netscaler IPs are going to change, whereas the VIPs in the bottom are the same.